I'm Steven Hayward, currently an inmate at UC Berkeley, as I usually put it, and I'll skip over my bio. You're going to hear too much from me this evening as one of the keynote dialogists, I guess. And one of the things that's really neat about this conference is we're now on to, maybe the second generation of scholars looking at fine-grained aspects of Reagan and the Reagan years. And we have several of them joining us here to look at specific aspects of it. Now, I am going to get off the stage here in about 20 seconds, but two things I will say about the format is I didn't get the bios of each of our panelists here today, so I've asked each of them to give them, a 20-second name, rank, and serial number, where they're from, what they teach, and so forth. And then after each of the presentations, I'll moderate some back and forth amongst the panelists if they want to, and then we'll take your questions, and then we will wrap up promptly at 5 o'clock for happy hour. So without further ado, let's have our first panelist, Takahito.
Thank you, Steve. My name is Takahito Moriyama. This presentation is based on my book that was published last year. My research examines the conservative movement in post-World War II years, focusing on their political media, especially direct mail. Direct mail has been overshadowed by mass media and internet, but the medium affected American politics in more fundamental ways than we imagined. Through examining conservative direct mail, this presentation critically analyzes the binary of emotion and reason. How should we regard the impacts of emotion on American politics, and what about the relationship between emotion and reason in society? In this presentation, I'd like to highlight rational irrationality, or how the new right during the 1970s elaborately employed negative emotions for political purposes by means of computer and cutting-edge advertising techniques. Since the 1950s, the scholarship has paid attention to emotional aspects of conservatism. When McCarthyism and the John Birch Society emerged in American society, the consensus scholars such as Daniel Bell and Richard Hofstadter observed the rise of the radical right in American society, explaining that the political phenomenon came largely from psychological distress. Daniel Bell wrote that conservatism was the politics of frustration, which motivated those who were not able to comprehend the complexity of modern society in the 20th century. Richard Hofstadter similarly pointed out the intense emotion and irrationality of pseudo-conservatism that frequently expressed negative emotions, including anxiety, resentment, and fear. And people were anxious over the fragility of their status in increasingly changing American society. So, arguing that the psychological distress stemmed from status anxieties, the consensus school took condescending attitudes toward the right-wing movement in which they observed emotion replaced reason. And actually, emotion was critical for some groups of conservatism. The New Right was a right-wing movement and populism during the 1970s. As a key figure, Richard Vigree was a political consultant and well-known fundraiser. Paul Weyrich was another New Right activist. He founded the Heritage Foundation, and later, he co-founded Moral Majority, which is a major group of the religious right in the 20th century. The New Rights relied on direct mail for raising funds and mobilizing grassroots. instead of circulating same message to the mass, direct mail enabled campaigners to send personalized messages according to individual preference. By selecting out likely customers or voters, then focusing solicitation exclusively on them, direct mail could get messages to people more effectively than conventional media. The evolution of computer technology further transformed the outdated method of writing letters toward a sophisticated advertising technique. As computers recorded a huge body of personal information, including not only names and addresses, but also magazine subscription, campaign donations, activists and politicians could discover prospective backers and carve out political niches more easily than before. At the same time, the New Right was a pragmatic movement as it made gains in new constituencies over the years. Vigorous direct mail successfully courted conservative Democrats and working-class Americans and who were frustrated with political, economic, and cultural changes from the 1960s. During the 1970s, when anti-elite populism spread across the nation, the Republicans, the New Right movement carried out campaigns to defeat liberal Democrats and moderate Republicans, assisting to bring about the Reagan Revolution in 1980. Important for this presentation is that vigorous direct mail incited negative emotions such as fear, anger, and anxiety by inflaming hostilities toward liberals and labor unions. For example, Paul Weyrich, a New Right activist that I mentioned, said emotionalism, not facts, swayed Hill votes. And liberals agreed with that. George McGovern noted that the New Right was substituting emotionalism for common sense. And likewise, George Meany, a long leader of AFL-CIO, noted that their language is always extreme, literally shrieking, doomsday is imminent, right around the corner, and so on. So during the late 1970s, the New Rights focused on several single issues to gain public support. One of the central issues was the ratification of the Panama Canal Treaties of 1977. Well, Panama Canal was not a new item on the agenda in U.S. diplomacy. America's negotiation with Panama had begun with the Dwight Eisenhower administration and then continued throughout 6 presidencies. Finally, on September 7, 1977, Jimmy Carter and Lieutenant Colonel Omar Torrijos agreed on 2 new treaties, which stated that the Canal Zone would cease to exist on October 1, 1979, and that Panama's sovereignty over the territory would be restored on December 31, 1999, so by the end of the 20th century. As of 1977, the Panama Canal was not a major issue among Americans, and even conservatives didn't take it seriously. For instance, James Burnham argued in National Review that the Panama Canal was no longer important militarily, and that the debates over the treaties were merely nostalgia politics. Likewise, another article in National Review noted, for conservatives, it presents a personal spiritual crisis. So it is not a crisis politically, economically, and militarily. So that's the arguments by Americans in general and by conservatives as well. Despite these remarks by other conservatives, New Right activists vehemently opposed the U.S. withdrawal from the Canal Zone. Their purpose was not to keep economic and military interests, but rather made use of emotional patriotism to garner support through such a narrow-minded issue. The anti-treaty movements indicated the nature of the new right's populist and emotional direct mail. On the other hand, for Reagan, the Panama Canal issue turned to be a critical topic as he aimed at the 1980 presidential election. After he failed to be nominated in the 1976 Republican National Conference, Reagan was required to distinguish himself from Ford through his hardline foreign policy posture. The difference between Reagan and Republican establishments was obvious over the canal issue. In October, the Republican National Committee mailed out 500,000 solicitation letters signed by Ford. The package enclosed a critical issue survey that asked for recipients' opinion on 10 questions. 5 of the 10 questions concerned foreign and defense policies, but did not mention the Panama Canal whatsoever. Ronald Reagan and the New Right carried out a cooperative campaign against the Panama Canal treaties. Vigourously launched an immense direct mail drive, which vividly demonstrated the New Right's populist aspects. In the fall of 1977, Vigourously sent out 5 million copies of a fundraising letter with Reagan's signature. I can point out 3 aspects of the New Right direct mailing. For example, it says, "I need your immediate help to prevent our country from making one of the most serious mistakes in its 200-year history." So, by using such an urgent language, the letter attempted to persuade voters to take immediate action. Misinformation is another aspect of the New Right's message. It reads, "One of our most vital shipping and defense waterways will be in the complete control of General Trejos," which is not true, because Panama would take back its sovereignty over the territory at the end of the 20th century, not immediately after the treaties. And overall, this letter stresses emotional patriotism. Combining the true story and misinformation, the New Right sent direct mailings such as like this to appeal to people's mind and heart throughout the 1970s. The New Right's massive campaign did not achieve its goal, as the U.S. Senate ratified the Panama Canal treaties in 1978. Nevertheless, liberals could not dismiss the threat of the New Right, and President Carter, for example, cited the New Right as a political menace. Over the course of the 1970s, the New Right showed its presence in the conservative movement. As Vigourously received money and letters from conservatives in response to his direct mailings, he collected names and addresses and many other personal information of more conservatives across the nation, enlarging the naming list and sophisticating his advertising technique. Vigourously and other New Right activists were ready for the 1980 presidential election that would result in the victory of Reagan. Many scholars and pundits have criticized the New Right for its offensive rhetoric, misinformation, and superficiality. However, unlike the consensus scholars and other historians asserted, emotional politics was not necessarily irrational. Now, New Right activists marshaled the technology by stoking negative emotion because they understood it was the best way to persuade voters to take action. It was the result of the reasonable use of sentiment for mobilizing grassroots supporters. In other words, the new right was a movement of rational irrationality that affects American political culture even in the present. Okay, thank you for listening.
Good evening or afternoon. I'm Jeff Bloodworth. I'm a historian. I'm at Gannon University in Erie, Pennsylvania. The age of Reagan resulted from Ronald Reagan engineering an electoral realignment to the political right. A decided ideological turn, the president's conservatism resonated with voters because of his liberal roots. Reagan made his conservatism the majority creed by tempering the old right's rough edges with an optimistic temperament, pragmatic politicking, pluralist worldview, and internationalist outlook. Reagan gleaned much of this tone and style from his time as a liberal and his political idol, FDR. Ironically, this liberal style helped birth the conservative age of Reagan. Reagan was ideally suited to woo disaffected Democrats. It was these voters and their political turn who made the GOP into an enduring majority party. Reagan's 1984 landslide pronounced this political realignment. In that campaign, Reagan used liberal symbols to bring erstwhile Democrats into the conservative fold. Indeed, the president's invocation of FDR and John Kennedy, along with his literal reenactment of Harry Truman's 1948 whistle-stop tour, were key in courting disgruntled Democrats, especially in the political battlefield of the Midwest. A Goldwater conservative in most every respect, the president preached a new gospel with a familiar cadence. Reagan convinced millions of Democrats that he and his conservatism were the rightful heirs to the mainstream liberalism of FDR, JFK, and Harry Truman. And in so doing, the age of Reagan was made. Now, Luke Cannon was right. The conventional wisdom regarding Reagan's political evolution is wrong. Reagan was typecast as a turncoat Hollywood liberal who went right in the face of events. But Reagan was and remains misunderstood. In a strict sense, Reagan's self-assessment that he didn't leave the Democratic Party, it left him, holds political water. The president surely changed policy stances in his evolution from left to right, but Cannon rightly points that his central political narrative, what Hugh Heclo termed America's sacramental vision, remained remarkably consistent. This represented the alpha and omega of Reagan's political worldview. Once mainstream in the Democratic Party, by the 70s, Reagan's sacramental vision was no longer welcome in elite liberal circles. In this way, liberal elites had left Reagan by deeming the sacramental vision hopelessly naive, arrogant, and parochial. Now, Reagan's telegenic good looks and preternatural communication skills clearly appealed to voters. By the 70s, his policy specifics surely mattered to a generation riled by domestic and foreign policy woes. But it was Reagan's sacramental vision theme which made him into a transformational president and a generational icon. In the 80s, Reagan repackaged an old tonic, conservative policies, in a familiar bottle, a sacramental vision of America. For Reagan, America possessed a divine mission in the world, Significantly, he connected this divine mission to the nation's immigrant stock. To him, Americans were made, not born. This distinction rendered America unique, but not superior. Neither a racist nor an ethno-nationalist, Reagan's democratic nationalism extolled an America that drew strength from diverse peoples. Excuse me, sorry, I missed a word here. That drew strength, I apologize. It was the nation's mission in Reagan's mind to spread this democratic and pluralist vision abroad. All humans in this formulation were capable of self-government. It was, in Hecklo's words, a sacramental vision, a material phenomenon that expressed a spiritual reality. To Gannon, Reagan's basic speech and political pitch were the same whether he was a Democrat or Republican. To be sure, in 1984, he emphasized big government's ills, while in 1948 he made big business his foil. But in both cases, it was a nemesis which restrained the U.S. from achieving its world historical mission. Part and parcel of this sacramental vision was Reagan's internationalism, pluralism, pragmatism, and optimism. This style and tone were not derived from nothing. Indeed, he largely absorbed this zeitgeist from his political idol, FDR. Indeed, Reagan took this mood and zeitgeist with him as he moved right in the 1950s. He, like millions of other Americans, were pushed and pulled by changed economic and political circumstances. Now, Reagan became a conservative before the tumult of the 60s, but this turmoil made Reagan's policy particulars palatable to the mainstream. Presented with a political opening, he packaged conservative policies and a sacramental vision gleaned from FDR in the 30s, which made his conservatism readily familiar and into the majority creed. To make conservatism the nation's majority credo, Reagan had to redefine conservatism itself. In so doing, he made many forget the conservatism that came before the old right. In 2016, Donald Trump signaled the return of the Eisenhower-Taft conservative feud. In 1952, as many of us know, Eisenhower defeated Robert Taft for the Republican nomination. In so doing, moderates defeated the old right and defined the GOP through the mid-70s. In the late 70s, Reagan defeated the moderates and defined conservatism until Trump. Trump's rise and the return of the old right is a reminder that Reagan conservatism is simply one flavor of this political ideology. In sum, Reaganism differs from the old right in 4 stylistic ways: optimism, internationalism, pragmatism, and pluralism. Reagan absorbed this ethos and style from FDR and early post-war liberalism. He brought this spirit into conservatism. Only in retrospect can we see how clearly Reagan conservatism differed from the old right. Ebullient optimism and faith in the future lay at the core of Reagan's worldview. In this, the old right could not have been more different. Anti-modern at their core, old right traditionalists looked to a neo-feudal past for cultural inspiration and revival. To them, free societies depend upon a virtuous citizenry that can only be maintained by an organic social order governed by institutional authority with the ballast of historical continuity. Reagan's internationalism knew no limits. His view of America as a redeemer nation made his support for Cold War interventionism natural. The old right, however, viewed FDR and Truman's policies as heresy. Non-interventionist through the 30s, conservatives backed the war effort following World War II. But many old rightists saw post-war treaties, collective security arrangements, and free trade pacts as abominations. Reagan's policy successes as both governor and president were grounded in his pragmatic conservatism. Give-and-take politicking, however, was an old right anathema. Russell Kirk has famously said of any pragmatic conservative, quote, "There is no such animal." To traditionalists, culture wars transcend transactional politics and amount to an existential battle for civilizational survival. Reagan's embrace of a pluralist immigrant America was central to his worldview and political success. A nativist could have never wooed white ethnics to the GOP. Reagan's political success made his immigrant embrace mainstream in most GOP circles. But the self-dubbed paleoconservatives brawled mightily against this central tenet. In so doing, they revealed just how substantially Reagan conservatism differed from that of the old right. Paleoconservatism's reemergence vis-a-vis Trump reminds observers of the distance between that conservative impulse and Reagan's. One of Reagan's forgotten legacies was his very quiet defeat of the traditionalist wing. The Gipper's personal popularity and roaring political success made any old right counteroffensive into a futile exercise. It should not surprise, however, that the traditionalists have returned as Reagan's legacy has waned. But marginalizing the old right was merely one way Reagan made his brand of conservatism into the majority creed. The 1984 re-election landslide cemented this realignment. Reagan's sacramental vision transcended policy particulars. It was the source of his enduring popularity. Nowhere is this made more apparent than in Reagan's re-election campaign in the 1984 Midwest, a region saddled with deep and sustained unemployment. The Midwest should have been Reagan's political kryptonite. Instead, he roared to victory in this region and the nation. He did so by making himself into the legitimate heir of the Roosevelt-Truman liberal political tradition. Clearly advocating different policies from those liberal presidents, Reagan used his sacramental vision to make himself into Truman 2.0, and again, with particular voters. Roosevelt and Truman were different in temperament and background. The duo, however, shared an ambiguous yet consistent adherence to America's world historical role in international affairs. A fair distance from Reagan's sacramental vision, these old Wilsonians nevertheless endorsed a crusading internationalism. In this way, their liberalism's whole was greater than the sum of its policy parts. To them, domestic reform and global leadership were tied, however vaguely, to the nation's world historical mission. By 1984, American liberals had largely dropped this messianic vision. Thus, Reagan had this lane all to himself. By promoting American greatness and its messianic mission, Reagan made himself into the heir of the Roosevelt-Truman political tradition. Reagan offered a world historical role for the nation and adhered to the Roosevelt-Truman style he had absorbed in the 30s and 40s. Reagan's 1980 landslide was a product of Jimmy Carter's unpopularity. Reagan's 84 landslide cemented conservatism as the nation's majority creed. In 1980, registered Democrats outpaced Republicans by nearly 2-1. To win and oversee a realignment, Reagan needed to woo Democrats on their own terms and on their turf. In his campaign in the Midwest, Reagan made himself into the rightful heir to Truman's liberalism. Now, Truman was not on the ballot in 1984, but a casual observer could have easily been confused. Reagan not only had Truman's original train car from 1948 refurbished, he adorned it with photos of the former president's 1948 campaign and literally used it to retrace portions of his iconic whistle-stop campaign. Reagan was a formidable incumbent aided by history and high poll ratings. Now, historically, incumbent presidents rarely lose, especially when they were as popular as Reagan. But the Midwest featured a deep farm and industrial depression that gave Walter Mondale a real political opening. Farmers voted for Reagan 2-1 in 1980, but sluggish commodity prices and high interest rates made the Middle Western Farm Belt his weakest region. Farms were not Reagan's only political difficulty. Across the industrial Midwest, a regional depression had pushed unemployment well into the double digits. In his 1984 campaign kickoff speech in his hometown of Dixon, Illinois, Reagan demonstrated his mastery of the sacramental vision motif, hailing Dixon for its unchanged values and traditions that made America great. He extolled the Midwest as the source of American greatness, and in the process, credited Dixon with his own ascent. By 1984, Truman's plain people liberalism had, in the eyes of many voters, become an elite philosophy so focused upon the nation's faults, they lost sight of its virtues. And in 1984 speech to Ohio voters, Reagan termed liberals the Blame America First crowd. Reminding the crowd he had been a Democrat for a good share of my life, he extolled Truman and passed liberals for recognizing the difference between freedom and tyranny. The upshot was that Mondale did not. Mondale's only route to victory entailed taking the Northeast, a select southern state or two, and sweeping the Midwest. He looked to the first presidential debate as a final opportunity to turn the contest into a race. At the first debate, as we all know, Reagan opened the door, and Reagan's early stumbles steadily worsened throughout the night. Afterwards, the contest briefly became competitive. The Midwest finally became a political battleground, and it was that region where Reagan, according to his own internal polls, was weakest. As fate would have it, the Reagan campaign had planned to reprise portions of the Truman whistle-stop train tour for 5 days after the first debate. Scheduled for Western Ohio, Reagan's train tour provided the perfect venue for media-friendly images and sound bites aimed at key constituencies. For Reagan to win and oversee a political realignment, he had to entice a significant chunk of the Midwest's 22 million blue-collar workers. To draw these Democrats, the president constantly invoked Democratic heroes of the past and wrapped his former Democratic self into their political cloaks. In what aides billed as the most expensive campaign trip ever, strategists had refurbished Truman's presidential car. Decorated with photos of FDR and Truman campaigning, the 13-car Heartland Special was slated to wind 150 miles from Dayton northward to the Toledo suburb of Perrysburg. For the Heartland Special, James Baker instructed speechwriters to invoke Truman's plain-spoken style. Following this act, Reagan promised Truman-esque, quote, very blunt truths. From the start, he did not disappoint. At the penultimate stop in Perrysburg, Reagan tore into Mondale, saying of his opponent's worldview, quote, if it's an income, tax it. If it's a revenue, spend it. If it's a budget, break it. If it's a promise, make it. After the speech, a fireworks display just marked the Republicans' renaissance and veritably symbolized Reagan's sacramental vision of American greatness. 1 week later, Reagan entered the second debate reinvigorated. Even Mondale understood that the election was over. Before noon on Election Day, advisors informed Mondale of his defeat. As afternoon moved into evening, the staggering nature of Reagan's victory became apparent. Winning 98% of the Electoral College, Reagan took 59% of the popular vote. Broad and deep, Reagan took more than 60% of the vote in 32 states and garnered over 53% in 11 states. Time precludes me from diving into the numbers in the Midwest, but the Midwestern numbers are not exceptional. They mirrored exactly the numbers basically in the South, in the North, and in the West. Ronald Reagan, there we go, was anything but a liberal. He cemented Reagan conservatism as the nation's majority creed by appealing to erstwhile Democrats, especially in the Midwest, via liberal symbols and a liberal tone and style bequeathed and learned during the 1930s and 40s. Ironically, Reagan made his conservatism mainstream by appealing to Democrats in a familiar vernacular. Thank you.
Hello. About there is probably good. I'm Cole Parker. I'm a PhD candidate in history at Boston University, studying sort of the American right broadly. On November 4th, 1980, as Ronald Reagan achieved what the conservative movement had strived for since at least 1964, one prominent conservative was far from celebrating. New right leader Howard Phillps of the Conservative Caucus, or TCC as he abbreviated it, experienced Reagan's victory as a considerable setback for the conservative movement as he saw it. And though he could not know it then, Reagan's victory would also mark the beginning of the end of Phillips's prominence in the movement. Despite his deep commitment to conservative causes, Howard Phillps, like many other leaders of the new right, would struggle to stay relevant in a country that seemed to be shifting rightward. There are many reasons why leaders like Phillips could not readily adapt to the new political landscape. Some reasons, like the limitations of direct mail or the rise of new conservative leaders, are important, but beyond my scope. I emphasize two other major factors that undid the new right, exemplified here by Howard Phillps and his Conservative Caucus, both of which were inherent to the new right's political project. First, maintaining, at least publicly, a steadfast independence from partisan affiliation had allowed new right leaders in the 1970s, perhaps Phillips most explicitly, to argue that their dedication to uncompromising conservative principles was of such purity that it came before any mere political party. However, conservatives within the Republican Party had by 1980 successfully cemented their control and transformed the party into the primary vehicle for achieving conservative political priorities. When Republicans actually managed to take control of the White House and Senate, new right leaders, with a few exceptions, were simultaneously shut out of policymaking and left trying to either criticize fellow conservatives from the right or take aim at liberals who appeared to already be cowed, if not outright defeated. Neither strategy could summon up the political support nor, critically, donations that the new right had previously enjoyed and depended upon. Second, Phillips, like other new right leaders, was correct in his belief that by the end of the 1970s in the U.S., a majority existed to support various conservative causes and candidates. This emerging conservative majority existed apart from partisan affiliation, with many longtime Democrats increasingly willing to jump the aisle. But Phillips erred in believing that these conservatives shared his complete political vision, and critically, that he could pull them in his direction. When these conservative voters instead enthusiastically backed Reagan as their standard bearer, Phillips, long mistrustful of Reagan and unwilling to compromise, saw support for his Conservative Caucus evaporate. So why Howard Phillips? Importantly, of new right figures, Phillips's papers at Liberty University are perhaps the most accessible. The bulk of them related to his work with the Conservative Caucus in the 1970s and early 1980s. But apart from access, Phillips offers a relatively complete look at the trajectory of a new right leader spun out to the political wilderness. Other new right leaders like Terry Dolan, Richard Viguerie, or Paul Weyrich either don't offer as complete a historic record or, as in the case of Weyrich, were actually able to successfully integrate themselves in conservative policymaking circles. Phillips was embedded in the very heart of the new right, and he left the records to prove it. So then who was Howard Phillips? Born and raised in Boston, Phillips became increasingly involved in conservative Republican political organizations while he attended Harvard. When William F. Buckley Jr. and William Rusher invited 120 conservative youth leaders to Buckley's home in Sharon, Connecticut in 1960, the young Phillips was among them. Howard Phillips was a signatory to the Sharon Statement and was appointed to Young Americans for Freedom's board of directors. At the same time, he continued to involve himself in Republican Party organizations. From 1964 to 1968, Phillips served in various local and national Republican roles. In 1968, he served as campaign manager for Pennsylvania Representative Richard Schweiker's upset win for a Senate seat, and then took a series of party appointments before flitting in and out of various low-level positions in the Nixon administration. At the start of 1973, however, Nixon announced that Phillips would be promoted to the head of the Office of Economic Opportunity in order to dismantle it. Phillips took to the task enthusiastically, bringing in a team of 26 temporary consultants drawn from the ranks of Young Americans for Freedom to help speedily dismiss staff and shut down offices within 6 months. In July, a judge ruled that Phillips's appointment was illegal, as he had never been confirmed by the Senate, and he resigned the next day. OEO survived a bit longer, but Phillips had made a name for himself in conservative circles as a man who would not flinch in the fight to unmake Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. A year after leaving the Nixon administration, Phillips founded the Conservative Caucus, the organization that would implement his vision for how to achieve conservative political victory in the United States. Organized groups of conservative citizens in every congressional district committed to demanding conservative policy or backing acceptably conservative candidates would ensure a conservative policy shift far greater than might be expected under any presidential candidate. Critically, these groups would operate outside of any one party. Instead, they would be bound together by a statement of principles drafted by Phillips. Commitments to small government, religious and economic liberty, and determined anti-communism were blended with support for law enforcement, as well as opposition to abortion, affirmative action, and school desegregation via busing. The national organization was intended to serve purely as a support mechanism for the establishment of caucuses in all 435 congressional districts and provide educational materials and leadership training. Local caucuses were instructed to adapt themselves to local issues and conditions. National staff was kept intentionally small, and positions within the Conservative Caucus were on a volunteer basis. But those volunteers were offered the chance to think of themselves as political insiders and leaders within the conservative movement. Explicitly, this is how Phillips sold the organization. Phillips intended to use this network of conservative caucuses to take control of the House of Representatives by 1980, the Senate by 1982, and the White House by 1984. These supporters could also be rallied behind individual causes like opposition to the Panama Canal treaties, perhaps Phillips' most successful campaign despite the treaty's eventual ratification. Early on, it seemed to Phillips that his strategy was working. Phillips visited every congressional district, and the head of the New Hampshire Conservative Caucus even won a Senate seat with no prior experience. Phillips felt that he would be at the head of a nationwide movement alongside other new right leaders. In reality, however, the problems that would eventually marginalize Phillips and the Conservative Caucus were simmering just below the surface. The first problem for the Conservative Caucus was money. The organization was perpetually in a state of financial precarity. Direct mail campaigns run by Richard Vigueries Ravco drove the Conservative Caucus's growth. Initially, this seemed okay. The first 6 months yielded 40,000 members and $500,000, which according to Viguerie mostly came in the form of small individual donations. By 1978, though, even after the record fundraising haul from the Panama Canal fight, the Conservative Caucus was still hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt, leading some Washington insiders to refer to the organization among themselves as Conservatives for Cash or Conservative Carcass. The national organization even required that any local or regional leaders turn over any funds they raised locally, allegedly to prevent mismanagement. This left local organizers in the unenviable position of being told to commit themselves to building a caucus engaged in lobbying and voter outreach, but without any of their own resources to do so. Despite predictions of impending doom, however, the Conservative Caucus benefited from Ravco's tendency to be generous with debt and carried on with Phillips' strategy. But this left the organization extremely vulnerable to any decline in revenue from their direct mail efforts. At least in theory, a large, dedicated membership base would have served to insulate the Conservative Caucus from any significant financial shocks. However, from the earliest days in 1974, membership was a dubious phrase, with virtually no relationship to Phillips's 435 caucus strategy. Membership was defined simply as anyone who had ever contributed any amount to the Conservative Caucus. This makes it very difficult to determine the exact size of the organization at any given time. Individuals who might have responded to a single piece of TCC direct mail were counted as members whether they knew it or not. From 1977 to 1979, the TCC Leadership Manual claimed a membership of 300,000. And by 1982, this had increased to 400,000. These large numbers were, of course, meant to give the impression of a substantial grassroots movement. But when those numbers were needed most, they proved largely ephemeral. While Phillips was establishing the Conservative Caucus, he was also staking out the independent, uncompromising conservative political position that would eventually winnow his influence. In 1975, he left the Republican Party, claiming that he regarded Gerald Ford as the most liberal president in American history. And if the Republican Party died, history would record it as a suicide. From then on, his only affiliation would be to conservative politics. As early as 1974, Phillips also expressed a deep wariness of conservatives pinning all their presidential hopes on Ronald Reagan. He instead pressed for a leader he felt was more reliably conservative, like Senators Jesse Helms, James Buckley, or Meldrum Thompson Jr. In 1975, as Reagan's primary challenge to Ford unfolded, Phillips crafted a strategy by which Reagan could prove himself reliably conservative by avoiding the Republican nomination entirely, instead cobbling together a handful of efforts to place himself on ballots in all 50 states as an independent. In 1976, informal polls of TCC members showed a large margin of members in favor of Reagan for president over any other potential candidate. This may explain why Phillips publicly remained fairly quiet about the primary contest, except for a blistering denunciation of Reagan's preferred choice of Richard Schweiker for vice president as a betrayal of conservatives. Phillips, of course, made no mention of his own role in putting Schweiker in the Senate in the first place. In private, he was more open with his feelings, describing Reagan as a very good script reader and public spokesman, but a man who lacks the stuff to do us very much good in the presidency. When Reagan, still extremely popular with TCC members, secured the Republican nomination in 1980, Phillips found himself having to toe a delicate line between his own aversion to Reagan and the clear position of the conservative grassroots supporters on whom he relied. Initially, Phillips tried to downplay the presidential race, instead reiterating his belief that control of Congress should be the first priority for conservatives. When it became clear that Reagan would be the nominee and that he stood a good chance of winning, Phillips pivoted to trying to keep Reagan from being compromised by what he termed liberal influences. He demanded that Reagan commit in advance to a list of his priorities, including the elimination of multiple cabinet-level departments, a more aggressive foreign policy in Latin America, and extreme cuts to domestic spending. For months, Phillips tried to meet with Reagan to push these demands personally, to no avail. Phillips's only chance to speak with Reagan before the election was during the Republican National Convention and left no opening for Phillips to bring up his list of demands. Instead, Phillips was one of a dozen new right and conservative leaders who met with Reagan to try and influence his choice of vice president. The group proposed no single candidate, only agreeing that George Bush would be totally unacceptable to the conservative movement and might endanger Reagan's support with conservatives. Reagan listened patiently and respectfully, and later that same day offered the nomination to George Bush. It was a warning sign that though Reagan was a through-and-through conservative, he would not consider himself beholden to conservative movement leaders, especially new right leaders like Howard Phillips. Despite Reagan's popularity, Phillips would not budge. From the RNC onwards, Phillips maintained an openly hostile position in TCC materials. He condemned Reagan as a man with conservative preferences, not conservative convictions. When Reagan soundly defeated Jimmy Carter and the Senate shifted to Republican control for the first time in a generation, Phillips would not relent. He demanded that Reagan commit to deep cuts in domestic spending, reject all arms treaties with the Soviet Union, and deal with the threat posed by Cuba. He may not have yet realized it, but the ground had already shifted under his feet. By 1982, it was clear that the Conservative Caucus was flagging. All mentions of the 435 caucus strategy had disappeared from their materials. The members' report, which had long detailed the efforts of local organizers, had instead become an outlet for criticism of the Reagan administration. A survey sent to active supporters this year, and I don't know what active referred to in that context, showed that members who bothered to respond to the survey had very little interest in most of the policy areas that Phillips proposed the Conservative Caucus focus on. The organization has managed to survive to the present on diminishing direct mail and later email fundraising, but it was clear that the conservative grassroots that the new right had helped cultivate going into the 1980s no longer needed them. The fate of Howard Phillips and the Conservative Caucus was shared by much of the new right. With conservative politics seemingly ascendant, conservative voters saw little need to contribute to conservative activist groups that made up the new right, especially ones critical of the president that those voters supported. Conservatives who had shifted from the Democratic Party to Reagan did not become Phillips-style conservatives. They flocked to Reagan, and many eventually followed him into the Republican Party, either through formal registration or tending to vote Republican as independents or even still as Democrats. These voters no longer had a need for new right leadership to channel their political passions. The decline of the Conservative Caucus resonates with the struggles faced by political activist groups regardless of partisan affiliation. More often than not, moments that appear to be victories for a larger movement are moments of intense crisis for the organizations that brought that victory about. The example of Howard Phillips and the Conservative Caucus also shows that grassroots conservatives, not unlike Howard Phillips, would enthusiastically back causes they believed in, but they could not be drawn away from their convictions. If Howard Phillips did not share their enthusiasm for Ronald Reagan, then Howard Phillips, the Conservative Caucus, and the New Right would be on their own. Thank you.
Hello. My name is Dave Cohen. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Akron and the director of the Applied Politics program there. This paper is part of a long-term project that I've been working with two colleagues from Virginia Tech on the Office of the White House Chief of Staff. You're probably wondering why I'm on this panel, because my paper really doesn't fit at all with the theme. And that's because I was on a different panel for tomorrow, but I was the only one that was actually going to attend the conference. So instead of having me sitting in a room by myself speaking, they put me on this panel. So bear with me. I'm also going to speak pretty fast because Steve is back there with the time cards, and I don't want to get pulled off of here. I'm going to try and use this. Hopefully I know how to use it. Also, Steve, I apologize for the length of the paper. A very long paper. As you can see, these are the modern White House Chiefs of Staff going all the way back to the Nixon administration. I have the Reagan Chiefs of Staff highlighted. I'm going to talk about all four of them pretty quickly and you know, at a pretty much a surface level because we're constrained by time. Jim Baker, Don Regan, Howard Baker, and Ken Duberstein. Just really quickly, some data I gathered about the tenure of the Chiefs of Staff, Reagan through President Biden. And as you can see, the Reagan Chiefs of Staff are at the bottom here. James Baker actually has the third longest tenure of all the modern Chiefs of Staff. And then, as you can see, we get to Ken Duberstein, who served for 6 months, closing out the administration. All right. Encouraged by many in his inner circle, such as the First Lady and Mike Deaver and Stuart Spencer, to consider someone with more Washington experience and connections, President-elect Reagan turned to Jim Baker, who was a favorite of the establishment Republicans at the time, and of course Vice President-elect George Bush. He was his friend, a former campaign manager, had also been a campaign manager for President Ford. His selection as Chief of Staff over the protest of many from Reagan's more conservative California contingent triggered the design of a hybrid arrangement within the White House. Baker and Ed Meese worked out a formal division of labor enshrined in a formal memo that was drafted and signed on November 13th, 1980, shortly after the election. This arrangement became known as the Troika, or the Triumvirate, and the first 2 years of the Reagan White House operated with essentially three foci of power, and three senior aides having direct access to the president. Of course, Chief of Staff Jim Baker, counselor to the president Ed Meese, who many thought would actually be the White House Chief of Staff and had served as Reagan's Chief of Staff in California when he was governor, and Deputy Chief of Staff Mike Deaver. The big three were each responsible for a different aspect of the White House political policy and communications process. Baker would oversee the flow of paper and people into the Oval Office and scheduling, appointments, communications, and legislative affairs. Meese, on the other hand, would oversee policy, and he would coordinate the cabinet and have cabinet rank. And that was one of the things that sold Meese on this arrangement, was he would have cabinet rank, the other two would not. And Deaver would be Reagan's image maker, and most importantly, a bridge to the East Wing and First Lady Nancy Reagan, whom he was personally close to. The last 2 years of the first term were, you could consider, a quadrumvirate when Bill Clark became National Security Advisor and also enjoyed walk-in privileges to the Oval Office. As most staff arrangements do in the White House, certainly the Troika operated with some friction, especially among the lower staff that were loyal to their principals, reflecting their different responsibilities and in some cases varying priorities, and I should say ideologies. The three often had competitive dealings, although Baker and Deaver often found common ground, and they were really very much a team in the White House. Many of these conflicts were aired and at least quasi-resolved in settings like the Legislative Strategy Group, weekly issue lunches with President Reagan, and at the outset in daily meetings about appointments to the administration. Over time, however, the very experienced and savvy Jim Baker, with his oversight of process, politics, and congressional relations, and his ties to the Washington press, became primus inter pares, or first among equals. And as chief of staff, Baker was able to negotiate a very challenging environment within the Reagan White House, with these different power centers, while working to buffer Reagan from external attack and internal strife. And he really is well regarded by many of his colleagues, except for maybe some of the California contingent, and most observers across the political spectrum. He is universally seen, I shouldn't say universally, he is seen by a majority of people, I think, as kind of the model of what a White House chief of staff should be. Near the end of his first term, or end of President Reagan's first term, Jim Baker was exhausted. He was ready to go home and go into the private sector. In November of '84, Secretary of the Treasury Don Reagan sat down for a lunch with Baker, and at this meeting, Reagan brought up the idea of swapping jobs. After a couple of weeks of reflection, Baker agreed to it, and Baker and Reagan decided to go ahead with this plan. They asked Mike Deaver, who was so close to the Reagans, to sell this idea to both President and Mrs. Reagan. On January 7th, 1985, Baker, Reagan, and Deaver went to see Reagan. And at the beginning of the meeting, Deaver said to the president, "I've brought you someone your own age to play with." Reagan announced the swap the next day to the White House press corps. That quote comes from Jim Baker's memoir. Reagan's second term really witnessed a very vast and rapid deconstruction of this unique arrangement that they had in the first term. With its separate power centers, Meese was moved over to the Department of Justice. He became Attorney General. Deaver left the White House in May of 1985. He was not replaced by anyone with the title of Deputy Chief of Staff. And units such as Advance and the First Lady's staff now reported directly to Reagan. He installed a strict hierarchy with himself at the top, and everything from paper and people, including the National Security Advisor, funneled through his office. The LSG was dismantled, and the number of cabinet councils were streamlined from 7 to 2. As chief of staff, his job was not to preempt decisions, but rather to ensure that all relevant interests and points of view became involved. Instead, he tended to shield Reagan and cut him off from this clash of ideas, which he felt made the president uncomfortable, but left the president isolated. He alienated White House staff, as well as others in the Beltway, including the White House press corps. Baker really cultivated that relationship. Reagan did not respect the White House press corps at all. When Iran-Contra happened on his watch, few were there to support him. He also made an enemy of Nancy Reagan, whom he infuriated by, if you recall, hanging up the phone on her. The final straw was the devastating observation of the Tower Commission report that says, more than almost any chief of staff in recent memory, he asserted personal control over the White House staff and sought to extend his control to the National Security Advisor. He was personally active in national security affairs and attended almost all of the relevant meetings regarding the Iran initiative. He, as much as anyone, should have insisted that an orderly process be observed. He must bear primary responsibility for the chaos that descended upon the White House when such disorder did occur. And so our disclosure did occur. He was dead man walking, essentially, after that. On February 27, 1987, Reagan, I misspelled that, not Reagan, Reagan penned a one-sentence letter that read, "I hereby resign as Chief of Staff to the President of the United States." They had asked him to stay on for a few days or a week or so to oversee an orderly transition, and he refused. When Ronald Reagan called former Senate Majority Leader Howard Baker to ask him to be Chief of Staff, he was informed by Baker's wife, Joy, that he was at the zoo with his grandchildren. Reagan joked to Joy, "Well, tell him I need him because we've got a zoo up here." Baker didn't want the job. In fact, he was running to be Reagan's successor in 1988. But the Reagan administration was in deep trouble, needed a well-respected figure like Howard Baker to clean up the mess. And, President Reagan, asked him to come up and help. And he wasn't able to turn it down. When Howard Baker arrived, he found a very dysfunctional White House staff in disarray, and there were serious questions about Reagan's mental state. Baker brought with him two close associates who he worked with over the years, James Cannon, Tom Griscom, who were immediately given the assignment to interview as many White House staff as possible and to really just make a general assessment of the situation. And their findings were not encouraging. Cannon, who was a veteran of the Ford White House, observed, quote, chaos. There was no order in the place. The staff system had just broken down. It had just evaporated. There was no pattern of analysis, no coming together. I took a look at some of the staff's paperwork and was stunned at their incompetence. They were rank amateurs. Baker understood that he had to quickly transform the process and personnel in the White House, as well as calm the nerves on Capitol Hill. So he began to clean house. He started getting rid of Reagan staff and replacing them with his own people who were loyal to him and to President Reagan. One of the keys to the new system was bringing in Ken Duberstein as Deputy Chief of Staff. Duberstein was an experienced Reagan hand. He had previously headed the Legislative Affairs Shop in the first term. He enjoyed a very good personal relationship with the Reagans. Baker's immediate task was to assess Reagan's mental and physical state, and the reports that Baker and his people received about the president's condition were alarming. Alarming enough that at a meeting at Baker's home on Sunday, March 1st, just 4 days or 3 days after he took over, Cannon, Griscom, and others broached the possibility of invoking the 25th Amendment. Baker instructed his inner circle to observe Reagan closely to see if there was any evidence supporting this claim of impairment. And much of Baker's first day in the job was actually watching Reagan. And he told reporters that, quote, I didn't see an AWOL president. Years later, Baker recalled that reports of Reagan's impaired mental state were, quote, really inaccurate. I never thought Reagan was impaired. I thought he was fully functional, and after the first staff meeting, I gathered up the senior staff and said, boys, this is a fully functioning and capable president, and I don't want to hear any more talk about that. Baker, however, observed a president that he characterized as down and despondent, but not depressed. So his cure for Reagan's malady was to get Reagan re-engaged. And so he scheduled a significant speaking program. He scheduled a bunch of public events for him, including, very importantly, a nationally televised address in which Reagan did a mea culpa. He personally took responsibility for Iran-Contra, which allowed the administration to move past that scandal. As Chief of Staff, Baker's personality, his style, and methods were a stark contrast from his predecessor. Reagan was a former Marine, Wall Street CEO. He delegated little, he ruled through fear, and his staffers were a bottleneck for information and people. And President Reagan was cut off from others in the administration. Under Baker, Reagan was accessible again. Baker managed through respect and collegiality, gave subordinates great leeway, and expected accountability. In return, unlike Reagan, Baker was comfortable delegating authority, and he trusted Ken Duberstein to manage the day-to-day affairs of the White House while Baker focused on the big picture. Baker opened up the process. By the way, I love this picture. This is Howard Baker sleeping on Air Force One and Reagan pretending like he's talking to him. Baker opened up the process. Though all paper and people flowed through Baker and Duberstein, he was not a bottleneck, but rather a facilitator. The staff felt comfortable with him, felt they had access to both the Chief of Staff and the President when needed. He had 3 goals for the waning days of the Reagan presidency: survive Iran-Contra, obtain an arms agreement with the Soviet Union, elect a president. You can see Reagan and Gorbachev there, that's signing the INF treaty. Though it was not all smooth sailing. You think the Bork nomination, for example, which was a disaster. He helped achieve all 3 of these for the administration. His approval surged the last 2 years of his presidency, and much of this was due to Baker's quick action upon his arrival. On the day of Reagan's resignation, Reagan's popularity was at 40%. During Baker's tenure, that approval went to 50, reaching 61%. And at the end of Baker's 60 months in the White House, Reagan's approval was 50%. I'm going to go really fast. I'm filibustering. I know I'm out of time, but I just need 2 minutes. Howard Baker handed the reins off to someone who was well-versed with the functioning of the White House and the duty of the Chief of Staff, Ken Duberstein. Duberstein commanded great respect in the White House for his knowledge and his Beltway experience as a lobbyist and as a public servant. And in one of his first moves, he hired M.B. Oglesby, Duberstein's former deputy and successor at Ledge Affairs. And together they formed a very tight-knit team like Baker and Duberstein had. And this duo was focused on solidifying Reagan's place in history, building on the upward trajectory after the Reagan debacle. They achieved this by focusing on high-profile presidential events, particularly foreign policy. This was a very successful event in December of 1988 in which Reagan and Gorbachev and President-elect Bush all had a photo op in front of the Statue of Liberty in New York City. Duberstein came back to the White House at a crossroads in the presidency when he worked for Baker. He acknowledged that when he returned, Reagan wasn't simply a lame duck, he was a dead duck. Okay. When Reagan resigned in February of 1987, Reagan's popularity with the public was in free fall, and talk of impeachment and invoking the 25th Amendment abounded, and they were able to quickly right the ship. Duberstein became chief of staff with 6 months left, and he helped bring that ship into port. And just very, very quickly, in conclusions, I'll just sum this all up by saying, Don Regan was not a very good example of a White House chief of staff. The other three really were, and we have a lot to learn, I think, from them and from their different styles. You can look at the Three Bears, that story. You don't want a chief of staff that's necessarily too strong or too weak, one that's really just right. And by the way, I would love to hear, if possible, at some point, from Senator Graham and some of the observations and dealings that you had with the White House chief of staff. Love to hear that sometime. Thank you.
If they had it here, it'd be in the way of the screen. Everybody speak up a bit. I think this will work. I'll hear us a bit. I'll be always packs for Oh, I know. I'll just connect the two thoughts. Well, actually, all three of them. So, liberal Republicans. You know, Mark Hatfield, Bob Packwood, Chuck Percy. Riker was still a Republican in the Senate. Today, we're down to what? Susan Collins. Observations. I don't know if you want to pick up any of those. Does need to talk. A little louder, yeah, sorry. Yeah. You have a handheld mic. Up to the podium.
I guess not. Okay. Can you hear me okay? If you look at the White House chiefs of staff over time, one thing that the successful ones have in common is a great deal of Washington experience. And one thing that particularly helps is even White House experience. But absolutely Washington experience. And Don Reagan did not have that kind of Washington experience. Yes, he was Secretary of the Treasury, but he was really much of an outsider, and he ruled in the Treasury Department much as an outsider. Jim Baker, Howard Baker, Ken Duberstein, these folks understood how White House operates. They understand how Washington operates. They understood that you can have some things that you want to do ideologically, but at the end of the day, you have to win the battles. You have to sometimes compromise a little bit in order to get stuff done. And I don't think Reagan understood that. And Reagan also, I think, was very power hungry. And I think most of the observations about Reagan, even from his own people, are that he was very, very power hungry. And he saw Reagan as almost just a puppet or a symbolic figure, and that he was the one that was actually running the White House. And I think I have it in my paper. There's a really damning quote from Ken Duberstein about Don Reagan, and that is that Don Reagan forgot that chief of staff, that title, the staff is the most important, and that Reagan was only focused on the chief part. And as a chief of staff, you have to always remember that your staff, you're not the chief.
I'll just do this. I think we'll turn it up now to audience questions. I'll just add, if I can, Cole, that the really shrewd observers, I think, said that James Baker operated by a simple rule. He may have disagreed with some of Reagan's ideas or tried to move chess pieces around to dissuade some particular course that people were launched on, but his rule at the end of the day was Reagan wins. I want Reagan to win. And if you don't have that in mind, you're not anyway. And the other person you mentioned very briefly, Clinton's first chief of staff, Mac McLarty, very accomplished utility executive, but not a very good chief of staff. And so what happens, he's succeeded by Leon Panetta, a person with a lot of Washington experience, and things seem to get a lot better, I think. I don't know. That's anyway, let's start doing some questions. I saw you had your hand up first. Shout really loud, and then we'll get someone up here.
Yeah, so I'm John Hill, and I teach at Hampton City College. Ironic comment for Professor Moriyama. Firing line, the famous Panama Canal debate. We're giving back the canal and approving the treaties. irony vis-a-vis your thesis, Reagan's arguments in that debate were all fact, tonnage. It was the least emotional rational, scientific, geostrategic argument. The other side, and I talked to Buckley about this 10 years after his death, and so knew him before then. He was entirely emotional. His closing argument was he strutted around. He had his peacock, when his peacock moments, and Bill could get that way. And he made an appeal for the Panamanians to have their own founding fathers flying flags of freedom. It had nothing to do with the canal. An interesting irony versus the conclusion. The roles were reversed. Entirely rational, scientific, geostrategic argument Reagan was bringing against the canal treaty. Highly emotive appeal by the lead.
Buckley reading from a James Thurber short story to try to lampoon
Yeah,
Reagan.
yeah, yeah.
It just fell flat.
I don't think he knew very much about the canal. He just knew it was good for data.
Do you want to come up and say a little extra on that? Come on up and say it. I'll just say that, just very briefly, that there's a matter of timing involved that's very important. Think when that treaty came in the mid to late 70s, after Vietnam, after Watergate. If that treaty had come up and been finished in 1958, I'll bet there's not much fuss over it at all. That's just a...
Well, like I said briefly, many conservative activists, especially National Review intellectuals, didn't think the Panama Canal issue is a big problem for Americans. Yeah, they don't care about the U.S. withdrawal from the Panama Canal because the canal played less important role by the 1970s. And by talking about the Panama Canal treaties and anti-treaties movement by the new right is because, I just consider, conspiracy theories or irrational arguments or absurd statements by conservatives. Why? It does matter sometimes for American politics. There are always some radical groups and conspiracy theories. The majority of Americans don't believe that. Still, some people support the movement. So in my presentation, I would like to emphasize emotional aspect of the conservative movement or of American politics in general. You're right. Well, it doesn't matter at all. But yeah, it is interesting, and I think it is important to point to this kind of movements for better understanding politics. Okay, yeah, thanks.
Senator Graham.
I don't, look, first of all, emotional, but it was emotional in the sense that another symbol of America. We stole the canal. Then we paid for it, and we built it. But you got to set it in context. Perception. And I think a reality. America was in retreat. The Soviet Union was in Afghanistan. A little bit later, but it was all part of the same America failing. Motion that Reagan tied into that really made him president, in my opinion.
That was what I was trying to suggest with my brief comment about the timing of it. I just add one other thought, Phil, is the Panama Canal thing was something that I don't say Reagan thought of or discovered it, but it was out on the stump, I think, first in Texas, where he said, well, and why are we giving away the canal? And the audience went crazy. It wasn't showing up in any polls. If you ask Americans, what's the top issues on your mind? Nobody mentioned the Panama Canal Treaty. So Reagan kind of made it an issue out of intuition, not for the first time. It was true of him in the 60s too, but. So anyway, Beth Fisher and I may talk about this a little bit tonight in our conversation we're going to do. So let's have another question in the back there. Jerry, by the way, Jerry, I didn't recognize you in your cap back there, and I haven't seen you in forever. I still tell people the story, and you probably don't remember it, but almost exactly 30 years ago, I had the privilege of having dinner with you and Milton Friedman in San Francisco. And I sat back and realized how very little I really knew about monetary policy as I listened to the two of you talk. All right. People always, I know who said it, but I've often used it. The difference between Bush and his people and Reagan and his people is the Bush people, they didn't have ideologies, they had mortgages. And they even kind of said that once or twice.
I
But
tell you where that came from.
oh, you do know this
Came
one.
from the personnel director.
Oh, right.
Who said, real early on, there was a desire among the Bush people to be different than Reagan. I don't know. Maybe they were just word different. But made the statement, they got mortgages and instead of agendas. But the problem with not having an agenda is president, and if you're not making something happen, it happens to you. And I'll say this about Baker and Bush. In my 25 years in American government, 21 years I've spent in finance. Baker is the best staff person that I've ever worked with. More ability, more capable of understanding what it was people were saying, all the staff members I ever worked with, worked for me.
Yeah, I mean, a summary proposition, which is if you go through Reagan's first term and look at mini disasters, just things that went wrong, in almost every case, I think it's correct that is when Jim Baker was out of the loop of the decision and implementation process, because you can't follow everything. he had a very good antenna for saying, well, you want to do this, here's where the problems are going to be, here's what you've got to think through first. And, someone else with a question?
All right, thank you so much for the question. Well, the history of direct mail is much longer than we imagined. Well, I heard that William Jennings Bryan, a populist Democrat, used direct mail at the beginning of the 20th century, but it didn't work at all because he didn't have computer, and the U.S. Post didn't have zip code and so on. So direct mail, I mean, a computerized direct mail played a role beginning with the 1950s. And it is interesting that liberals used political direct mail for the first time. So there was a political consultant firm by liberals in New York. And yeah, they focused on anti-communism, which was shared by liberals and conservatives as well. So conservatives learned how to use direct mail in politics. So yeah, like Richard Viguerie used computer and direct mails. And one of the reasons why Viguerie's direct mails was more sophisticated than liberal is that Viguerie employed ideology dramatically for direct mailing. So he knew that hope and positive emotions were not so important for direct mail. Rather, his policy was attack liberals, attack Republicans, attack moderates, attack even some other conservative activists. So Viguerie, the direct mail was successful for a brief time. However, by the 1980s, the market of direct mail was saturated as many other used direct mail. So if you donate money to Republican candidate, many other Republican groups, conservative groups, and others sent you a bunch of direct mail, and you might be fed up. You're going to be tired of that. So direct mail became garbage mail. Almost nobody read it, just discarding without reading that. So Viguerie's direct mail techniques was very unique and sophisticated during the 1970s, but it didn't work by the late 1980s.
Almost out of. Is that Annie Bandit? Did I see you over there? Yeah, I did see you. I need a new correction because Annie Bandit is on a panel tomorrow. Was my TA for a course on the presidency at Berkeley. Have you seen this new paper that Jake Grumbach has just put out on actually, I still think he's young, but he's a Berkeley PhD. He's really good. He's very far to the left of me, but he's really good. He has this new paper out, very quantitatively oriented. That's his real skill. And what he's determined is that the median age of a donor to federal campaigns is 66. And I think if you just ask Richard Viguerie or Bruce Eberle or any of the old direct mail people, they'll tell you their sweet spot for responses is elderly people. They have more time. They like getting some mail. And quite aside from the yields of these things, and that's always been a matter of controversy, it's a way of at least communicating with some people, and they like getting something in the mail and gets, and yeah, appealing to emotion. Okay, certainly that's true. Quick question, because we're about to go overtime.
It's
Yeah.
a gossip question.
Oh, okay.
Okay. I remember Peggy Noonan Reagan once told her that he didn't care what anybody. Is that real? Did that?
Probably. Reagan said, yeah, that's right. That's probably true. Well, we're here for another 2 whole days, so we've got lots of time to talk about this and other things. So I'm going to draw things to a close. I think the bar will be open shortly. Alas, since I'm talking tonight, I don't get to enjoy myself, but I will enjoy meeting all of you. Thanks.